Okay, so everybody's got this agenda. Again, I'm Brad with LHB. This is Michael. We've got district construction and traffic staff here as well tonight, as well as I know we've got city administration, council folks, and the mayor here. To give you an idea of what we want to go through here tonight, we want to talk about the project. I know a lot of people in the room have been involved from some early stages. Some of you, maybe this is one of the first times you're engaging with the project, and we want to give you an idea what the project entails. Then we're going to take you through step by step what the project consists of and what the stages are for the construction. The work is very predictable in how it will be built in a lot of respects. We'll talk about that, then we'll get into the construction, staging, and phasing work that we've done, the option that we've come to that we think best fits the needs of the project and achieves the goal of trying to minimize impacts while also trying to maintain access to the downtown area. We'll spend some time talking about what can be done to prepare for construction between all parties here, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions and discussion looking to leverage all the staff and people here who have been involved with the project to have any one-on-one discussion over the layout or with any of the exhibits. We're happy to do that after the meeting and stay as long as it takes to get those questions answered. So with that said, this snapshot is literally comes from the title sheet that'll be on top of the plans. And the thing here tonight, I think we're going to really focus on the impacts in the downtown area. But the project does extend outside of the limits of Grand Marais. So basically, when you look at this map, the yellow highlight is the corporate limits of Grand Marais. Down here near the south end of the project, about 3 miles south, the project begins near the Fall River, goes through Grand Marais and goes for about 7 miles north of town and ends there. So before we get into this, we want to maybe try to give a quick overview of what the project entails and some of the terminology we're using. So the project actually consists of different types of construction work. So 4 different types of work, some within town, some outside of it. Rural mill and overlay. When we talk about rural work on this project, we're going to be talking usually about the work that's outside of town. So that's basically what that's going to mean in the context of this discussion. It'll be the version of Highway 61 that you see when you come in and out of Grand Marais, a lane of traffic in each direction, 10 to 12 foot shoulders, and grades that go down to a ditch. That work out of town from a roadway perspective is pretty much mill and overlay work with some details that we'll get into. And that's where we mill the surface of the pavement a couple inches and put it back, and that's a rehabilitation to get some new life out of the pavement. Urban, the next 3 bullet points, urban will generally refer to work that's in town. So urban has that meaning, which means we're in town. It also generally refers to a roadway that has curb and gutter. So that's the major use of that term. And then we've got 3 different types of work within town. We've got a mill and inlay, which basically is the same type of work, a preservation scope. We'll show you some slides on that. Then we've got what we call full depth reconstruction, which is basically the idea that we're completely digging out and putting back the road, and we're also doing utility work below that road. So that's kind of we're tearing down the house and rebuilding it option. And then we have kind of a hybrid of those two, which we're calling the partial reconstruct. And that goes from Broadway to the Gunflint, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, but it involves both some of that preservation mill and overlay scope and some fuller depth digging. So this slide shows you a comprehensive view of the project. The light, that's not meant to happen. So the light blue areas down here are that mill and overlay work, south and north of town. Again, we've got about 3 miles south of town that's mill and overlay. That starts down by Coyote Ridge. And then north of town, just past the Gunflint, we get into mill and overlay work again. South of town, we are replacing the Fall River Bridge or box culvert, and that's going to require short-term closure of Highway 61. We'll talk about what that means in terms of traffic and potential needs to detour. Here, this is that urban mill and inlay work. So we'll look at this, but basically from this point south or west, and I'll apologize in advance for this confusion. Statutorily, Highway 61 is considered north and south. That's how MnDOT refers to its highway. Very aware that within town, the highway generally runs west to east, and so I'll be balancing those terms as best I can. But Coming from the west or come from the south, you've got 8th Avenue West. But west of 8th Avenue West, we're not really changing the geometry of the street. It'll be the highway you're used to, but it will get that pavement reconditioning, and there'll be a little work on the walks. The bigger impact begins at 8th Avenue West and goes to Broadway, and that's that full depth reconstruction where we're talking about digging the road out, digging utilities out. It'll be a big impact in the downtown core. From Broadway, from east of Broadway to the Gunflint, we've got that partial reconstruct section. So again, all this adds up to about 11 miles of overall project. 3 miles of rural mill and overlay south of town, half mile of full depth reconstruct, half mile of partial reconstruct, and then 7 miles of mill and overlay in the rural section north of town. So to give you a little bit more clarity on what this means, now we're just going to really narrow cast this down to what's happening in town for a lot of this discussion, but we'll come back to some of the bigger pieces out of town. So this is the urban preservation or the urban mill and inlay work. This is what we call a typical section. So if you basically imagine the road as being a piece of cake and we took a slice and pulled that wedge out, this is the cross section of the road. And the thing to take away here is you've got the in-place geometry that I'm sure you're all familiar with. We've got that 12-foot center left turn lane, a lane in each direction, these variable width shoulders that are either parking or turn lanes or versions in between. The dash lines on either side depict that we're really not doing anything. That's an existing condition that's going to persist. And the dark line atop the top of the pavement shows you that all we're really doing is that thin veneer of pavement within that road core. So again, the geometry of the road isn't changing. This is work that is generally done under traffic and is pretty straightforward. The work that is happening in addition to this is what we call ADA work, Americans with Disabilities Act. That'll be selectively replacing some sidewalk panels for people that have disabilities or mobility issues, but relatively minor in the scope and scale of this project. This section shows the full depth, urban full depth reconstruction and utility work. So when you think about this project, there's a number of participants, but MnDOT owns the highway, MnDOT owns the storm sewer, and the city is a partner in the project because the city owns a lot of the utilities that go beneath the project, and the utility portion of this involves city water and sanitary that we'll get into. But again, from a cross-section perspective, the big takeaway here that's going to come into play as we go through this discussion tonight is you've got the top section of the highway shown above. Again, it's a similar section as you come down. It's basically anywhere from 54 to 59 feet wide, curb face to curb face. And the layout process that the city went through with MnDOT came to a revised typical section, which is a road diet, as we call it, or basically a narrowing of the highway, so that the new pavement section really eliminates that center left turn lane. We've got a lane of traffic in each direction, 2 12-foot lanes and 10-foot shoulders. So you go from a road that was anywhere from 54 to 59 feet wide down to a road that's pretty much consistently 44 feet wide. So it's a narrower road. In contrast to the previous section, the work extends deeper within the core of the road. So the road will get dug out to a depth of 36 inches. That's depicted in this section below, where we have about 30 inches of base material beneath the highway and then 6 inches of pavement on top. New curb and gutter, new sidewalk on the north or hillside, and new shared use path, bituminous shared use path off the back of the curb on the lakeside. And this section depicts the area from east of Broadway to the Gunflint. Same thing on the top. We have the in-place pavement section. The main thing here that again, I know you're all familiar with is that we have curb generally on the north side of the street, but we've got this rural condition within the city where you don't have curb for the most part on the south or lake side of the street. And what we're going to do with the project is we're going to put that new curb in on the south side, so that's where we call that partial reconstruct, because we're digging down in this portion. We're also putting new walk that'll extend all the way down to the Gunflint on that lakeside. That'll cast down into the existing ditches and areas south into the lakeside. Very little curb replacement for the most part. That curb and walk and infrastructure behind the curb will remain in place. And then we get back to that thin veneer of pavement work where we'll do the mill and inlay, and we'll get a new pavement surface out of the project in that area. So those are the three major work types. So what we want to talk about with this next sequence of slides is, again, to give you an idea of what to expect. This is what the project's going to look like on your front doorstep. And the thing that we can say about these slides is that, again, this is very predictable. The projects of this type are not unique. There's definitely a flow and logic to how do they get built. So as we go through this, it should give you a good sense of how the project's going to progress and what the major elements are and what impacts you can expect. So at the start of the project, of course, the contractor shows up, and the first thing he has to do is separate his work area from the areas where the traffic and the people will be during construction. So we call that mobilization phase. The contractor installs these perimeter controls. That'll include the traffic control signage, and we'll show you what that'll look like and what the implications of that are. You'll have these barriers adjacent to pedestrian walking zones where you have business access. And this slide on the right really gives you a sense of what that'll look like, especially in the downtown core between 3rd and Broadway. The work zone will be immediately adjacent to a lot of building storefronts. There'll be an active work zone right in the heart of downtown, and it'll be there for that entire construction season. But we'll talk about that. There's some nuance there. So after mobilization, what happens? Well, the first thing, of course, is they're going to rip off the surface pavement, and pretty much everything within the MnDOT right-of-way is going to get pulled out. So the excavator comes in, rips the pavement, rips the curb out, loads it into the trucks, and we get rid of everything, basically exposing that base material beneath the highway. Then the next thing that you can keep in mind here as we go through here is that the next phase for the contractor is to start the utility work. So as I mentioned, the city, when MnDOT came to the city and said, we've got this project, the city responded that, we want to be involved and we have existing infrastructure that needs to get replaced. And one of those pieces is city water main. So there is water main that will get removed and replaced with this project from 8th Avenue West to 5th Avenue West. And there are also crossings at the avenues that are listed there. The main thing here is that the contractor generally builds the project from the deepest utility up, and water is usually one of the deepest utilities next to the sanitary sewer. Typically at a depth 7 to 10 feet to be below the frost depth. And the big thing I would draw your attention to here is when you go down to 7 to 10 feet, in order to build an OSHA safe trench and meet all the requirements that contractors have to, they have to lay that trench back. So when you go down 10 feet, you're laying a slope back that creates a swath of excavation that's anywhere from 20 to 30 feet wide as you go down where that water main is. So that's a representative section of what that's going to look like, and it extends, this water main, if you don't know, really runs parallel with the road, and we'll show you some slides. So one of the things I'd mentioned that'll get into the construction staging and sequencing is, of course, when you build a new water main, there are people that are relying on that water main, so you can't simply dig it up and tell people we'll come back in 3 months when the water's ready for you. So a key initial phase for building a water main is to build a temporary water main. So there'll be a smaller diameter water main at the surface that'll get built, disinfected. There'll be a connection to that temporary water main for each service that's on the current main. There'll be a short interruption of service, usually 4 to 6 hours. And that'll be coordinated in advance as much as possible. The contractor should know where he's at. He'll tell people, we're going to do your water service today. You'll be out of water for a few hours. Once you're connected to the temporary water main, once everyone is connected to the temporary water main, the new water main gets installed. And then at the end of that, there'll be a similar interruption where people are taken off the temporary water main and put back on the permanent main. And this is, sort of an interesting aspect of this project. We're doing 2 types of water main replacement. We're doing sort of the classic, we're going to dig it up and build it back. And the other one we're doing is called pipe bursting, where we'll use the in-place water main as a conduit to pull the new main through using a pipe cutter. So same process, same impact to the public really for either method. After we get done with the water main, the city has old sanitary sewer that also needs to get replaced in this part of the project. The old sanitary is very similar to what's shown here. It's old vitrified clay pipe. It's very brittle. And in the case of the existing water main and for the city, it's in very poor condition. So it wasn't an option to do anything where we could line it or do anything to rehab it in place. It's really got to come out. This utility is also 7 to 10 feet deep. It'll get replaced with new PVC pipe. The picture here shows the connection between the old and the new. And this is sort of the same thing, but it's a little bit less impactful or disruptive to anybody that has a service connection to this. They'll bypass flows to get around the work area, and the contractor will ask people to limit their water usage during that period where they're connecting to the service, but should be less consequential than the water main connection. So this is a snapshot from our current plan. This shows a segment from 6th Avenue West to 5th Avenue West. The sanitary main is depicted by the long line with the 2 arrow dashes. So you can see that's the water main. There's manholes. There's also service connections coming off that have to get connected. And then you can see the water main, which is on the other side of the highway, runs laterally with the highway, and then you can see all the branching service connections that come off of it. So it's a big impact within the core of the highway, but that's actually not unusual. That's typically where water and sewer utilities are. The next utility is storm sewer, because it's usually the next shallowest pipe. Storm sewer, I think everybody knows, is the system that collects the rain and storm water from the highway that goes into catch basins, down into pipes. This tends to be shallower, so that big trench that we talked about tends to get a little smaller. There's a little bit of a trade-off there in that the catch basins tend to be a little more clustered at intersections, so you'll see a little bit more impact as this slide tends to depict at these intersections. You'll have all of these leads coming from various catch basins into the trunk main. So you limit the depth and width of it, but it's a little bit more impactful typically at those intersection locations. And I guess just to point out, these are the catch basin structures or manhole structures, and that's the pipe, obviously. It's usually a reinforced concrete pipe. So this is another snapshot from the plan for the storm sewer at 7th Avenue West. Here you can see the catch basins spaced along the highway, collecting the drainage from the highway. Any water coming down the avenues is also intercepted. That's where all these nodes collect to go into these manholes and then down the hill and into the lake eventually. Another overlay for the project that's unique in this urban corridor, somewhat unique I should say, is we have box culvert work at 4th Avenue East. So the box culvert here is a 10-foot wide by 4-foot high box culvert. That's statutorily, technically makes it a bridge. We also have a box culvert that's even bigger at Fall River. That's I assume everybody knows, south of town. Box culvert construction, bigger pipe, precast segmental construction, typically lowered in place by a crane, locked together through jointing and tie rods, and then these apron structures get involved. Right now, that work is at 4th Avenue East, and there'll be some staging and sequencing that'll need to happen to basically try to build that culvert half at a time as we go through it. So kick traffic one way, build half the box, kick the traffic the other way, build the other side of the box. But it is a bigger excavation that's going to happen in the downtown core. This is a snapshot of that box. It's highlighted in yellow, spans the full width of the highway. There's some retaining walls that need to be built at the inlet to protect the slopes against erosion and scour. The storm sewer connects to it, and then there's actually some sanitary sewer that gets rerouted. So it's a significant piece of work in your downtown. And then we have a even somewhat more unique part of the construction. This is what we call the MPCA dig. The area highlighted in yellow between 3rd Avenue West and 2nd Avenue West is an area where there are petroleum contaminated soils. You can see in this case, this jagged line that you see is the somewhat irregular right-of-way that extends down the corridor here. And the takeaway here, as you can see, is that this work extends into these parking lots on the north and south sides of the highway in this area. This gives you another view of this. This is a contour map of that excavation, and this dig will go 10 feet down to grab these contaminated soils and get rid of them. And this spans roughly 100 feet by 100 feet in each direction. So it's a big hole and is a big part of some of the staging considerations we had to look at in looking at the project. Another piece of this that's trails and flows from everything else is what we typically call third-party utility adjustments. These typically are power, communications, fiber, telecom, and lighting. In this case, the city's got ownership or interest in lighting and power. But typically these utilities move at the behest of MnDOT and the city to make room for their utilities. So in this case, power poles may need to get relocated or held during construction. This orange interduct is typical of a 2 to 3 inch fiber line that might need to get adjusted to make room, for instance, for that big box that we're putting in. So that's another component of this work that has to get done and coordinated by MnDOT's contractor as part of the work. So once we get the utility work, we can then pivot to the roadway work. And this slide is actually a very representative section of what MnDOT's going to do with this highway. It's in a nearly identical subcut depth to what you're seeing there. So that worker there, this is also a 36-inch subcut. What will happen here is they'll dig out the road to that depth. They'll put down this geotextile separator fabric, which is meant to protect these new clean engineered soils from the native soils beneath. The white lines are subdrain pipes that keep groundwater from infiltrating into the roadway core, which can cause soft soils or issues with frost heave and cause issues down the line. And after that subcut and that first sand layer gets placed, this is the typical operation. You get a dump truck that comes in, drops the sand in, the bulldozer comes behind, pushes it out in 6 to 8 inch lifts, and then a compactor has to come in and sequentially build those layers so we get the good compaction that'll make the roadway last in that section. After we build that sand layer, we can start looking at the operations to get to the paving. We put in an aggregate base layer that's typically 6 to 8 inches thick. This is a paving platform, so it's a denser material, it's more impermeable. Gets placed in the same way, but instead of a compactor just kind of rough grading it, the motor grader will come in, fine tune those grades to the final contours and cross slope of the highway. And then we can get into the curb work that'll be part of the project. So here's a curb machine, the long linear sections of the project where we have curb. This curb machine will place that. At each of the intersections, if you look at the layouts, we've got bump outs. And again, this depicts this more handwork that we've got here to get the ADA compliance and grades that we need at those intersections. Once the curb is in, once the base is trimmed up, we can start looking at the paving operations. And so again, just to talk about paving, there are two types really that we're talking about. Within those areas that we've talked about, mill and overlay and mill and inlay, it starts with this operation where they come in and they mill the pavement off. So that's literally a paving machine that comes in, the teeth grind the pavement up and eject it into the truck and get rid of it. And then in either case, once the pavement's milled or once that base is ready, this paver comes behind. And again, I'm sure everybody drove through Two Harbors, so at some point I'm sure you guys got to see this more close and up personal than you may have ever wanted to. Once all of that's done, we still have work to do. We've got the surface features that we've got to get in. There's a new signal system that'll be put in at Broadway. That's the only signal system that's being built with the project. So that's a signal mast arm. There's usually a signal cabinet that has the controls that'll dictate the sequence and timing of the signal. And last but not least, we've got the street furnishings and amenities. So there's work going on. I think as Michael mentioned, the city got grant funds that it can leverage to use for a number of these amenities, but this is everything from benches, trees, anything that really kind of beautifies the streetscape from a pedestrian point of view. This work, including lighting, ornamental lighting, all of that's on the table and is still being worked through as kind of the final design progresses. This will all try to get in. Obviously, it's usually the last thing that gets done. The thing to mention here is that we typically do see that trees and plantings might have to extend even into the next season because you run out of time for the ideal growing season to get those plantings established. So that's the project sort of from beginning to end. It's a big project. Obviously, it's very impactful. And what we want to talk about next is the construction phasing and staging. And so I think as Michael mentioned, the key thing that we're looking for here is how do we build the project efficiently, but how do we balance that need for efficiency with the obvious need that this is a highway that goes through your downtown. It's vital to the downtown, so we're trying also to minimize disruption, provide as much access as we can to residences and local businesses. So we've looked at a number of different options and want to talk with you a little bit about some of the background and engagement we've had with the city up to this point that have got us to the point where we think we can say this is how we think the project will be staged and phased. So as Michael mentioned, we go through this series of questions that we have to ask ourselves or obliged to ask ourselves. How can we maintain traffic? Because obviously that's a big piece of the puzzle, especially as all this traffic leads into the downtown. So the first thing we ask ourselves is, when everybody looks out there, it's a relatively large tarmac of pavement. Is it possible to build this project in a way that we could maintain a lane of traffic in each direction? So what this section shows is a plausible version of that we looked at, and the things I'd point out to you are we have sort of prescribed minimums for what we can get away with here with this section, even under construction. We can compromise a little bit on some width during construction to be practical, but really when you look at an in-place curb line, we need to maintain 2 feet from that curb for what we call curb reaction, away from the edge of the driving lane. We can have narrower 11-foot lanes, but really don't want to get much narrower than that, especially with the level of traffic and the truck traffic you see through town. And then we still need to have usually a barrier. Again, those deep excavations in several parts of these projects really mean that we have to protect not only the public from those excavations, but also the workers from the traffic. So traffic barrier will be part of the project component. In order to do that, we need to have offsets from that barrier. In this case, we're showing a foot. The barrier itself is 2 feet. And you usually need some distance behind the barrier to allow for deflection in the event that it's hit. You don't want to build right up to it. And what we found out, if you kind of think back in that picture that we showed you of the water and sewer, and with the way the road is narrowing up and the proximity of these utilities to the highway work, it doesn't work out. But that's the simplest thing I can put to you. We cannot maintain a lane of traffic in each direction and get this project built, A, because the highway is getting narrower, and B, because of the utility work. So the next option we looked at is if we can't maintain a lane of traffic in each direction, what level of traffic can we maintain? So this option shows what we're calling the one-way driving template. This driving template basically is obviously half of what you saw before with basically the same dimensional characteristics. It adds up to about an 18-foot platform that we would maintain for traffic, and it works. So we can maintain a lane of traffic adjacent to the work zone to get the water, sewer, the deep excavation for the roadway subcut, and the narrowing of the road. So that's an option that we carried forward. And as Michael mentioned, this is looking like a 2-year project. I just want to talk quickly about schedule. Michael mentioned we're about 70%. We're wrapping up design going into the early part of next year. This project is going to let in May. And the way the contracting process works and the material procurement process works, that means that the most likely construction start date is sometime in July, probably shortly after the 4th of July holiday. So phase 1 takes us into 2019. And this is basically, phase 1 is what we're calling the 2019 construction season that would extend from July, date to be determined, until the end of that season, which is usually weather dependent, but not typically too much later than October, mid-October to November if we get really lucky with some warm weather. So again, up top, you can see this inset shows the project. It's the same one that we looked at before. The intent in 2019 is to try to do a lot of the pavement work outside of town, do that work that we can, including the Fall River bridge work. When you come into town, the current thinking is we'll build what we call that mill and inlay urban preservation work from south of town near Fall River Road to 8th Avenue West, but we'll also get into 8th Avenue West and try to reconstruct that to its final condition as part of that year 1 work. From Broadway to the east, we'll do the work that goes from east to Gunflint. We're looking at doing that box culvert. This section and portions of this work, though, will likely trail into the next construction season. The big takeaway that I'd give to you here is, with the exception of the work at Fall River Bridge, generally this work will be done under traffic with lane shifts and flagging. So under 2019, for the most part, the highway should be able to carry a lane of traffic in each direction, subject to the interruptions and constrictions of that work. So then in 2020, we've got more going on, and what we've done is we've had to take phase 2, 2020, and break it into what we're calling phases A, B, and C. So earlier slide showed it, I didn't really dwell on it, but typically construction season starts early to mid-May, goes to mid-October, late October if we're lucky. So this first slide takes us from May 15th to June 15th. And the first thing I'll mention is the blue here is the carryover of any remaining work that would have to be done from east of Gunflint. But the critical components here are that one lane of traffic that we're looking at is the area shown in green. That's in the eastbound/northbound direction, going from 8th Avenue West to 3rd Avenue West. From 3rd Avenue West to Broadway and including Broadway, we're looking at fully closing Highway 61, including that intersection. In order to get this work done and maintain traffic, we're looking at a signed detour that'll take traffic that's coming into town, and we'll show you what this will look like and give you a little hint of it. But the basic idea is there'll be a signed detour that directs traffic up 8th Avenue West, over to 5th Avenue West, up to the Gunflint, around and back down. There'll also be signage here that says if you're intending to go downtown or access local businesses, you can stay straight and get into the downtown core. Part of our work with the city to this point and coordination with the county identified that it generally was not seen as desirable to have traffic between 5th Avenue West and the Gunflint. So the area that's shown in brown here is traffic closed but open to local traffic. So it's signed as such, but really with the prevailing intent that we're directing traffic who doesn't intend either to go downtown or is passing through to use the detour around downtown. This little segment here is the MPCA dig, and this red dash line is what would be the avenue to get out of town. So 1st Avenue West, while Broadway is closed, would be the way to get up and out over to 2nd Street and get back to Highway 61 or make your connections. So once we get to June 15th, there's another change in the way the work progresses. And the big change here is that in that first 4 weeks of the project, we're obliging the contractor to get out of Broadway to fully build that intersection and reopen Broadway to traffic. So this segment of the project is substantially similar, going from June 15th to July 31st, in that one lane of traffic persists down to 3rd Avenue West. That local through route goes down Wisconsin, comes up to Broadway. The area from 3rd Avenue West to just west of Broadway is fully closed to traffic. And the detours, the signed detours and the restrictions in this area are the same as we discussed previously. So that's phase 2B, June 15th to July 31st. And then phase 2C, the latter part of the construction season, the major change here is that we're requiring the contractor to have that downtown core complete and reopen to traffic as of July 31st. So that's the area from 3rd Avenue West to Broadway. This area will remain the one lane of traffic in the eastbound/northbound direction, and that work will have to persist again. I think Michael mentioned it. If you were looking at it from a contractor's pure convenience, you'd say close everything and you'd get the maximum benefit in terms of the shortest duration of the project, but you'd also get the maximum disruption and inconvenience for everybody in town. But the trade-off you have anytime you maintain traffic is that you lose efficiency. So this work, we gain efficiency by closing this, and we're able to get this downtown core back to some semblance of normality after the first part of that construction season. But the utility work that's needed here, the requirement to maintain traffic will mean that this work will continue through the second part of the 2020 construction season. One thing I did want to mention that would be true also of all phases is that right now there would be a temporary signal, it's thought, at 5th Avenue West to help manage the traffic at that intersection, which was seen as being one of the more critical intersections that would need that control. So to take a step back and kind of talk about the rural plus the urban component to this, in 2019 we talked about it's thought that we'll go after that Fall River Bridge in that 2019 construction season. In order to do that and get that bridge out of the way, the work that's involved there not only involves realigning the box, but will involve rock blasting to get that new box in there. I'm sure anybody that drives by Fall River can see the exposed ledge rock that's there. So there'll be rock blasting in order to get that work done, which is going to take about 3 weeks. Highway 61 would be closed there. And MnDOT would work on a detour that would use County Road 7 as the bypass route to get traffic around that work zone for that interruption. That's what would happen in 2019. This would be in effect for that period to get the box culvert in at Fall River. In 2020, this route would persist as a route for oversized, overweight, and truck traffic to get people on County Road 7. Obviously, the red here is the town. To zoom in then, just to give everybody that sense of scale and proportion, the County Road 7 detour coming from south or west side of town. Here's the local detour that we talked about going up the Gunflint and coming back down. So that's the 2-year construction phase. Again, thought that the work can get done in 2 years. Maybe some final cleanup and final plannings, depending on how everything wraps up in that downtown core, but generally should be done in a 2-year time frame. So again, this is just to give a little sense of what to expect here. This is kind of a condensed Cliff Notes version of signage. This signage gets spread out over a much larger distance. Anytime that somebody encounters a construction work zone, there's spacing of several hundred feet to get you to the point where you say, hey, there's work ahead, there's a detour ahead. But in order to give you that graphical representation, we'd be telling people there's a detour coming, the dates, the road work is ahead, the signed detour taking people on 61 up and around as we talked about. This sign says, what does it say? Road closed, local traffic only. That's where the one lane of traffic in that northbound, eastbound direction would persist. The signs here telling people if you're on 61 and you're going to keep on trucking, this is the way you should go. If you want local downtown business access, go ahead and stay straight to get into the downtown. Similar arrangement of signs. This is the other approach and really identical in all respects. We're telling people that if they're going to stay on 61, there's a route for that. If they want to get into downtown, they'll go downtown, use the businesses, and circulate through the downtown, either come back to 61 or go up Broadway. There'll be options there for that. So that's construction, staging, and phasing for the project. The next part that we want to talk about are the steps that can be taken and we're inviting people to take to get ready for construction. So the background here is there's really 4 parties that are part of this process, right? There's MnDOT, there's the city, there's the contractor, and then there's the community made up of businesses, citizens, residents. And there's different levels of control and influence everybody can have to make the project a success. And this is a list of the typical issues that come up during a construction project. And as we go through these, I say the things that I draw your attention to are there are things that we can influence, and then there are things that we won't be able to influence or will have limited influence over. So one of the big components in the first bullet item is communication, and that's probably one of the biggest parts of this that's going to be critical, and we'll talk about strategies for that. But people like you and everybody will want to know what's going on with the project, what's happening where do I need to go to get to my destination. These construction traffic dust noises, these are sort of the unavoidable nuisances of construction. They can be mitigated by the contractor by controlling dust through watering. There's a likelihood that we'll have weekend and night work. Again, we're trying to balance the issue that some of those service interruptions, some of that work that might have to happen at the front of a doorstep doesn't probably want to happen during a core business hour or a key period of time. In order be true to that goal, we've got to give the contractor the flexibility to do work on off-peak times. So there'll be some of that give and take that'll have to be considered and built into the project. We already talked about service interruptions. That's the water, sanitary component. Big component, obviously, is losing some of your front door visibility. So business access, visibility of signage, and how to deal with reduced customer traffic going in front of your business due to closure or partial closures. Big things for local businesses and residents to think about are how do we get deliveries and waste disposal. There's also obviously a lot of parking that's going to get displaced by the project. There will be no availability for parking on Highway 61 when the work is being constructed, so there needs to be thought given to that. That first slide showed you some of the issues that we're all going to be facing with pedestrian and vehicle detours. How do we get vehicles into town that want to be there? How do we get vehicles around traffic that are passing through? And how do we maintain that pedestrian access for people that get out of their car and still want to go to business A or business B? The other big one, obviously, is you've got a number of community events that are going to be impacted by construction. How does the community respond to that? The construction is happening. Can those events be staged or sequenced in a way that takes that into account? And that last bullet item is really to get at kind of those things that we're not going to have as much influence over, but are risks in the project. Those are things we don't know about. You know, the street hasn't been dug up in a while. There's always things that come up. That's the nature of these projects. There are things that will come up that will have to be addressed as part of the project. There's also the potential for bad weather, which can stretch everything out. So there's no risk-free option here, and there's obviously a lot of things that could either make this project go very well or could make it go worse. But as we continue to think about this, there's some sort of proven strategies and things that we look and invite comment on. So to go back to the comment card that we made available, that comment card is really asking you to try to think about and respond to any of these ideas that really seem to make sense from the community perspective. And I think both the city and MnDOT are very interested in seeing who might be willing to be engaged and help with ideas about any sort of groups or task forces that might want to be set up to help everybody get ready for construction. So key things to think about. We're here tonight looking and planning ahead. That one's sort of obvious. Establishing project-specific community resident and business group task force. Something strongly to be considered and encouraged. Obviously, you've got Chamber of Commerce, but even thinking about ways that people can pool resources to look at things like advertising or communication are really key and can really help. Consideration of those community events and things that might need to happen. Businesses looking at what you can do to encourage people to come downtown. Project branding, business promotions, discounts, all those things can try to reinforce the image and the message that the downtown is still open for business and you want people down there. Things to look at, and we'll get into the different roles here. There's different ways that each of those four participants can contribute to this, but obviously a lot of businesses have website presence, using those, leveraging those maximally, thinking about those promotional campaigns. One of the key things to think about that is really important and has been shown to work is if businesses can pool and find ways to do on-street signing or ways to reinforce wayfinding for people who may be accustomed to getting to Grand Marais and doing it this way and now find the construction has kind of changed the layout of the street. So do you direct people to your downtown core? Do individual businesses find ways to get new marquees out on those alternate or temporary routes? Parking is a big one. Trying to think creatively about what parking you have that could be used differently or leveraged to provide that overflow parking that gets displaced. And then a strategy that MnDOT has used on some projects, particularly around some of those big community events, is to look at maybe there's a place where you can have displaced parking and you can get a partnership to have some transit or people brought into the downtown to try to relieve some of the pressure of the traffic. So to go through this, what these next couple slides are meant to identify is really, there's roles that each of the entities in this project will have, and there's roles that each of those entities will do better than others, and there are some that probably those entities shouldn't be involved with. I think one of the messages that I would say, that having done some of these projects in the past, is nobody is going to know better what's good for Grand Marais than the people and businesses in Grand Marais. MnDOT and the contractor, they're limited into what they can know about what works for you and what advocacy they can bring. So your creativity in that part of it is going to be huge. But to talk about the role that MnDOT has, MnDOT will have weekly construction meetings during the project. MnDOT already has a project website, and they'll engage and keep that current so that people traveling to the area and use that website will be able to see the current state of the project and see what it's about. MnDOT will take the lead coordinating with people like the city, Cook County, emergency medical services to make sure that routes through the community that are displaced or interrupted are known to those key service providers and are well coordinated. The contractor, in contrast, we're expecting to have a requirement in the plan that will mean that they'll have a designated point person that'll be responsible for liaisoning, if that's a word, with the public and the city on key issues. And during those weekly meetings, they'll be giving regular updates. Where are they going to be? What's coming up? And trying to give everybody the best sense of when is that service interruption going to happen? When is that traffic switch going to happen? When is that work in front of that business going to happen? And we're going to have to flip the pedestrian access route to the other side of the street and look at some of those things. So again, that communication piece is a huge part of this. The part here is really this community role that, again, that comment card and that advocacy on the city's own behalf is going to be critical. But any businesses, community partners, anybody that can step forward and be willing to participate or volunteer in that work with the city at a local level to really think in advance about what this project means for the city and come up with those creative ideas to get the word out, implement some of the strategies. Again, the ideas that we're putting there are ideas that we know have worked in other communities. They may not all fit well for Grand Marais, and you may have even better ideas that we didn't touch on. That's a key part of what we're trying to hear tonight. The last piece, and not the least, of course, is the city's continued involvement. They're an active partner in the project. They have work in the project. They're expecting, and I know Mike and the city administration, mayor would all say that the city will have a presence during construction to get the word out and be a partner to do everything we can to mitigate the impacts of the construction. So looking ahead, I think we've talked about it, but the next major milestones that are happening, again, this project will letting is the term that basically means that's when the contractors will submit their bids. This is a low bid process. The contractor who has the lowest responsive bid will get the project. There's a contracting period. There's a period where they need to order materials. So that period of a couple months between May and July is when that'll happen. And again, that construction expected to start July of 2019. And we expect to have ongoing coordination with the city, again, as part of their involvement with the project. And then hoping also to invite participation and integration with any groups or any of those stakeholder groups that want to step forward and be a partner with the project. So with that said, that's our presentation for tonight. Again, we wanted to invite anybody that wanted to linger. We will be here. We'll move over to the layouts. The city, MnDOT staff here can help answer any questions. And again, if you can leave your comment cards, I think if we can just leave them up here, we'll collect those. I think between the city and MnDOT, we've agreed that we would provide responses to any questions that are posed in those comment cards and get back to people. And we'll take that as next steps. So, excuse me, almost losing my voice. Want to thank everybody again for coming tonight and appreciate your attendance. And that wraps up the meeting, the presentation portion, at least for this point.